Hello, and welcome to People of Letters on FinCrimeTV with me, Nigel Morris-Cotterill. My guest today is Becky Holmes, author of the wildly successful Keanu Reeves is Not in Love with You. It's an irreverent but highly relevant look at a particular type of fraud, romance fraud. Becky started baiting fraudsters on Twitter and soon found herself deluged with proposals of every kind, and possibly the world's largest collection of dick pics, which might cause some eyebrows to be raised if a laptop were to be examined at customs in countries such as, and I kid you not, Australia. Becky Holmes, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for that introduction.
Over the years, long predating social media, people have been baiting fraudsters, but they've had little more than a niche following. You've done a spectacular job in getting the topic of online fraud onto coffee tables and into commuting bags. And look what you started. I found this while I was researching for this program. Romance scams involving cyber criminals engineering a romantic relationship in online dating platforms for monetary gain. It is a cruel form of cybercrime where victims are left heartbroken, often facing financial ruin. We characterize the literary landscape on romance scams, advancing the understanding of researchers and practitioners by systematically reviewing and synthesizing contemporary qualitative and quantitative evidence. The systematic review establishes influencing factors of victimhood and explores countermeasures for mitigating romance scams. That's from an academic paper called Tainted Love, a systemic literature review of online romance scam research. And it's by Biltz, Shepherd, and Johnson of Dundee University. They've checked a number of databases of what academics like to call the literature, and they've extracted information from that. I've noticed that research produced to be accessible to ordinary people is largely discounted by the academic world, even though when we look at extracts like this, we can see some considerable similarity between this and your work. And of course, while your book continues to be accessible to all, that particular paper descends into pretentious and pompous English that I don't recognize in great part. So while academia has its place, it's your book that changes lives. So let's have a look at a couple of those things. They say that romance scams leave victims heartbroken and often facing financial ruin. You write about that with case studies, but I get the sense that the emotional burden really affected you. What was their worst emotion? Was it guilt for losing the money, embarrassment at the rejection and realization that it was all a trick, or is it shame?
It would be hard to differentiate between those. I'm tempted to say it's 33.3% recurring each one. I think shame plays a huge part, and embarrassment. And it's one of the reasons why victims of romance fraud often sort of isolate themselves from their friends and family, because they feel they don't want to report it, and they certainly don't want to tell people that they know because they fear being labelled as stupid or naive or gullible. You know, in actual fact, fraudsters and romance fraudsters in particular use incredibly clever coercive control. So the people who are defrauded by romance fraudsters, they're none of those things. They just happen to be people who believe they're in a relationship with somebody who needs help. So guilt for giving the money away, certainly. In one particular case, there was, I interviewed a lady called Sue in the book who gave away her son's inheritance. And she was consumed with this guilt and she couldn't tell him. And she actually died before she told him. And it was me that had to tell him. So the guilt she felt, it was heartbreaking. And that was because of embarrassment and shame. So the three are absolutely intermingled.
But she sounds as if she was in it on her own. I've had a number of cases where, including, there was one case, a very senior military figure, and his friends and I literally tried to keep him in a room so he couldn't go to meet somebody to hand them money. And he got very, very upset with us and hasn't spoken to several of the people in the group for some years now. So even when somebody is standing there saying, do not do this, this is a really bad idea, it still happens. I don't think it's fair to say these people are being stupid. I mean, there are some who fall for the Nigerian prince scam. Yeah, they are pretty stupid, frankly. But in most cases, it's not stupidity. It is that the fraudster is incredibly good at manipulating emotions, and they have some very clever scripts, as I'm sure you've seen.
Yeah.
And are we ever going to be able to say to people, just shut this down? Don't. We can't really, can we? Because the people who are doing this believe in true love. They believe it's going to find them. They believe they've failed at everything else, including wandering into a bar and meeting somebody. And this is, in many cases,
I
last
mean,
ditch attempt, isn't it?
Who now meets somebody like we used to in a pub or a bar? It just doesn't happen. You know, I met my other half online. You know, it is the way to meet people now. So it doesn't seem that unusual to be speaking to somebody and to form an emotional relationship. It's just not, it's no longer not the norm.
I agree.
And one of the problems is, and I've spoken to, you know, oh God, charities, not-for-profits, even police, who've said that they've been and spoken to somebody and said, look, we have, you know, this proof, this absolute definitive proof that this person is a fraudster. And the victim still will not have it, because it's one of those things where I think in a lot of fraud, there's this suspension of disbelief. And, you know, you so want this to be true. And the coercive control is so strong, and they've used every trick in the book that they will, and this is the other thing I should say, really, a lot of fraudsters will effectively groom their victims. Absolutely. So they will say, you know, when you go into a bank, you will be told this is what you need to say. If the police turn up, they don't understand this, my darling, this is what you need to say. So the victims are effectively groomed into expecting this. And when it happens, their bond with the fraudster increases, because they think, they knew more than I did, that, you know, they know they're looking out for me. So it's incredibly difficult when somebody is within the throes of one of these relationships. It's incredibly difficult to get them to understand the reality.
Yes, I think that is I think one of the things that people who are outside it cannot get a grip on, how hard it is to turn that attitude around, because it becomes absolutely ingrained in them, doesn't it? So,
absolutely.
You had a lot of fun baiting the fraudsters. Your pilot in the right at the beginning of the book, your pilot, I was just killing myself laughing at that. The man clearly was quite an idiot. The fraudster was the idiot. I mean, you sent him a photograph of an empty airport terminal, and he still thought that you were on the way. Lunatic.
It was the sheer panic of him that I enjoyed. This utter panic of, no, my darling, what are you doing? You don't need to fly here. And you know what? That was the particular example that really took off on Twitter all those years ago, and where I thought, oh, do you know what? There is something here, and I had so much fun from then on. I'm very grateful to that particular fraudster. It's not often you
I
say
love the twist
that.
at the end of the story, which is that you actually knew people who knew the person who knew of the person whose identity he was using, and that there was absolutely no way that the persona he was putting up was going to be the real persona. I think it's just hilariously bad. The ignorance of the idea that the victim might turn around and do some research is one of the big persistent issues here. That we know that the simplest of research frequently shows up the fraud at a very, very early stage, and yet victims don't do that. They don't do a reverse image search. There is one character on LinkedIn. She's got 17 profiles of wildly different jobs and countries and whatever, the same photograph, and yet LinkedIn, which could easily have the technology to stop to identify that and block it, chooses to do nothing about it. There is a dating site, a little one run by just a tiny team somewhere in Southeast Asia, but I don't know exactly where they are, because they keep themselves very much to themselves. It's called Date in Asia, and every photograph that goes on there is subject to a reverse image search. Now, if they can do it, why can't
Oh, that's
LinkedIn?
interesting.
Why can't Match or OkCupid and the like? The technology is there and it's free. So it is obviously a question of will that these large companies don't do it. And in my way of thinking, they are exposing people to risk that that should not be there. I mean,
I find
you talk about
yeah,
the reverse search.
I do, and I think it's something that we need to educate people on, because even now, you know, where banks are sending out messages about fraud, etc. Even now, people, when I talk to them, they say, "Oh, what's that?" So it's not widely known. The other thing is, I actually have a friend who was online dating, and this is a real life person, very good friend. And she said to me, "Oh, I've just matched with this bloke." And I looked at him and something went off in my head. I don't know what it was, but I thought, those photos are very, very staged. There's a lot of those. He's incredibly good looking. I'm not sure his profile makes sense. Now, if I hadn't been doing what I do, I would have said, "Oh, good for you. He's gorgeous." But I put a reverse image search in and he is everywhere. This poor man, his image is everywhere. And now she is my age, so she's mid-40s. She hadn't thought to do a reverse image search. We then messaged him because I said, "Oh, look, it'd be interesting to see what he says," and said, "Your image has come up everywhere on a reverse image search." And he said, "I know that. My image is being used all over the place. It's awful, my darling." So he was aware of it and he had an answer. It's like when the fraudsters pretending to be celebrities, when they contact me and they say, "I hope you haven't spoken to another Keanu Reeves because my profile is being used all over the place." So they're aware of it and they just make it into part of their narrative.
Yes, absolutely. The reverse image search is old. I mean, I wrote an article maybe 15 years ago about how a website that was promoting something had a number of very high-profile people in the regulatory field, apparently speaking at a conference, and it just didn't hang true for me. So I checked it, and all the people whose photographs were there were not the people that were said to be speaking. Every single one. There were photographs of people in the industry, but they were the wrong people. And you think, why would you bother doing that? I mean, why would you make your own fraud? It's like
and also, you know, they're going to get found out very clearly because, oh, do you know, I just, when you work in the sort of counter fraud industry and you know about all these things, it makes no sense to you. And you think, why would you do that when you can be so easily found out? But of course, an average person, I'm doing that in those awful inverted commas people do, who doesn't work in counter fraud, which, let's face it, is 99% of people, why would they know? Because I think our world, now I used to work in financial services and it was exactly the same there. We all talk to each other on LinkedIn. You know, there's lots of academic papers that go to other academics, but we're sort of not talking to the right people. We're preaching to the converted. So we all walk around thinking, well, why don't people know this, that, and the other? Why would they?
Well, I know the answer to this. But we know that one of the reasons that people don't learn about this is that they're not receptive to the message in the way that it's been delivered so far. And that's through, in some cases, online courses, in some cases, books, in some cases, documentaries on TV, in some cases, visits to school by police, social workers, or whatever. They don't want to hear it from somebody in authority. And what they absolutely do not want is to be sat down and somebody said, we should have the talk. And it doesn't matter what age they are. We have that same problem. We can't even get people to go to coffee mornings, elderly people to go to coffee mornings if fraud is on the agenda, they don't want to come. So it's, can you see a way? I mean, your book is incredibly accessible, and because of the humor and the way that it's presented, it's reaching a market that generally has not been reached before. I hear from people that this is the way to get to people, and at least make them think, which is one of the things. So you make a couple of points that I'd like to reinforce for our viewers. The first is that changes in techniques and technology don't mean the nature of fraud changes. So underneath it all, romance fraud is just the same as any confidence trick that creates the illusion of a relationship. I think it's a very strong point that you make, and a very important point. How important do you think it is that people recognize that, and that it can help them to identify fraud at an early stage?
I'm going to answer that from a romance fraud specific perspective. One of the interesting things about the human race is that one of our greatest needs is to love and to be loved. If it wasn't for that, the species would have died out. Now, you could argue that perhaps that's the best thing for us, but that's what would have happened. Now, you can put technology blockers on a lot of things. So you can put pop-ups saying this could be a scam. You know, you can have AI warnings, you can have reverse image searches, etc. But when there is something as intrinsic to human nature as wanting to love and be loved, we will overlook a lot of red flags because it's built in. So when you're trying to get somebody to look for these sort of triggers, these warnings, I think romance fraud is the hardest one to tackle because of this overwhelming need to be wanted. You know, I have that. You know, we all do. Perhaps not many people would admit it, but I'm a terribly needy creature. You know, I'm exactly the sort of person that would start speaking to somebody. If I didn't know about this, I would absolutely start speaking to somebody on social media and believe that it was real. It's in my nature, you know, and I'm not afraid to admit that. Romance fraud, I'm not sure we will ever be able to tell people to not. I don't think we'll ever be able to tell everybody to look for the signs.
I have an intense dislike of the term red flags, except in the sense you're using it, because in the sense of financial crime generally, a red flag is not a red flag. It's a warning sign. But in your case, we want red flags. We want people to stop. We want people to say, I am not going to do this. And we want them to do that at the earliest possible stage. One of the things that's noticeable in several of the cases that you talked about is that we get a sense of speed from the fraudster. So the fraudster is they come along, they say, hello, how are you? You say, I'm fine, thank you very much. Then 3 or 5 or 10 messages later, they want to live with you. And that kind of speed, to me, that is so clearly not how real life works. I mean, if you went on 3 dates, if you meet someone in a pub, go on 3 dates with them, and the third date they're saying, I think we should live together, you're going to think there's something strange here. But you can have 10 messages, which is a total contact time of 3 minutes or something, and you believe it. So why do you think the medium of the messaging over the internet is so much more powerful than it would be if you met that same person face to face?
So something that I say in the book, and I only sort of touch on it briefly, is that when you meet somebody online and you haven't met them in person, everything that you want that person to be, in your head, you can make it. So let's say you have an ex-husband who used to do X, Y, Z and you hated it. You might well tell this fraudster, now suddenly they're going to become the exact opposite to that. They're molding themselves to exactly what you want to be. And I think because you're only chatting online, it's much easier to sort of make plans and say, right, yes, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do the other, because it's not immediately going to happen. So you can say to somebody, yes, I think we should be married, but it's not like you're walking down the aisle that day. Fraudsters, they have this kind of, they give you this sense of urgency in all cases, because a lot of the time they want to reel you in before they ask you for money, because they want to be able to kind of isolate you from friends and family. You know, don't tell your sister, my darling, because she'll think it's too soon. She doesn't understand. And there are other things as well. So they want you to get off the platform very, very quickly. I don't want to talk on Twitter. It's really impersonal. Let's change numbers. Let's swap numbers and talk on WhatsApp. Now, once you're on an
Viber, which surprised me, because I'd completely forgotten about Viber. I hadn't used it for, God, I don't know, 10, 12 years. And I'd forgotten.
Never heard of it. I'd never heard of it until this lady told me.
Okay, so is it now back as a high risk platform?
Well, funnily enough, she's the only person that I've interviewed who has spoken on Viber. I've never been asked by a fraudster to move on to it. I've asked a lot of people if they've heard of it, and they haven't. Now, this particular lady who was moved on to Viber, she hadn't heard of it either. So I don't know whether it was kind of an old school fraudster who was still using the older platforms. What I would say is that all platforms, are used for fraud and for romance fraud. So it's kind of a case of, it will be quite easy to think, well, it's an older one, it's probably not used so much anymore, but that's a case in point that, it still is.
It's also that we tend not to remember where these things are. I mean, Viber, from what I recall, is basically an Israeli product. Kakao came out at the same time as Viber, and that's basically South Korean. Kakao got loads more people using it, but Viber was a rock solid platform for voice communication. It was much better than Skype, for example. The last time I was using it, which was said it's a very long time ago. So different platforms have different advantages. So if he's suggesting Viber, it may well be that it's because he plans to talk. Although I think one of the things that you noticed is that it's quite, a lot of the fraudsters don't want to actually get on the phone because they are not particularly fluent when they speak, or they have the wrong accent. Yes.
Of course, now with the advent of dreaded AI, that's not going to be an issue anymore. So it used to be that you could say to somebody, look, if you can't, they won't let you speak to them, or if they won't let you see them, there's something wrong here. And that was a really tangible thing that you could try to get someone to understand. Now, of course, that's not the case. They can just say, well, I spoke to him last night. So it's interesting, though, going back to the Viber case, he did actually speak to her. And it was interesting because she didn't detect an accent. She said it was a very good American accent. But again, there's this, and I've heard this from a lot of people, but that when they look back, they think, oh, I'm not sure it was completely American. But again, it's that sort of suspension of disbelief. If you think you're in a relationship,
it is. But when we think of the fraud factories, which tend not to be romance frauds, but they're frauds for things like I'm from Microsoft support, things like that, that are run out of tower block factories in India. Those people doing that have often been trained by American companies to speak with American accents, to be familiar with what's happening in the USA as to sports and the like. So they have current affairs, so that they were the telesales units, offshore telesales for the USA, and their accents are impeccable. They're not very good at English accents, but they are very good at, a lot of them are very good at American accents.
It's interesting, isn't it? I've heard people say a lot in the past, it's much easier to do a convincing American accent if you're talking to an English person, because there are so many sort of variations across the states that you're not really going to challenge it.
That's true. That's very true. But I think one of the things that we also tend to not with American, the way Americans speak, and a lot of these fraudsters are using American voices, aren't they? Is that they do not. We used to be able to say, if it's going to be artificial intelligence, I don't like the term artificial intelligence, but if it's going to be computer generated, then we're going to be able to identify that because of variations in inflection. But now, if you watch so much American TV for the last 2 or 3 years, they have completely changed inflection, and it sounds almost mechanical. It's almost like American has been turned into a tonal language. So you hear the same phrase, no matter where a context is, it still sounds exactly the same. And that I think is going to provide a great boost to computer-generated fraud, because people are not going to think it's weird anymore. I think that's that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah,
So,
interesting and horrible.
absolutely, yeah. I'm quite happy using these things for marketing because I think it's funny. But I'm not very happy with the idea of it being used for commercial purposes and becoming normalized in that way. You know, when I say marketing, I don't mean that I don't want people holding a conversation with my avatar. I just want to sit there and watch it and think, that's funny. My God, that bloke's ugly. Why is his mouth not moving in the same way as his words are coming out?
The thing is, though, I've seen recently examples where that's not even the case. That they're moving, it's indistinguishable from the real thing, and I do not like it. It's, for me, it's the thing of dystopia. You know, I find it terrifying, and I'm fully aware of how incredible it is and how it's going to be useful for a lot of things. But personally, I'm terrified by anything computer generated, voice cloning. I think it's awful.
I think we are still some time away, although 2 years ago I would have said where we are today was at least 10 years away. But we are still some distance from having a conversation like you and I are having. You can have conversations, but not with something that is that good yet.
Yeah.
But it will happen, and it's going to happen at the speed of development, and probably within the next 2 to 3 years, and maybe the next 3 months, if I'm as wrong as I was last time. You extend the thing about there being basically fraud being one thing to say that while some people see this as a cybercrime, that exactly the same happens with telephone calls, WhatsApp, email. And so the widespread concentration on dating apps is a bit misleading. And that approach pleases me greatly, but it's unusual. Why do you think it's so hard to divorce risk assessment from the medium in which the message is delivered?
I think it goes back, in the case of romance fraud, it goes back to this need for human connection and this sort of suspension of disbelief.
True.
Exactly. And as you get further into it, so in the book I talk about the fact that I used to gamble a lot, and it became a real problem. Now, as I was gambling, putting more and more money in, I was thinking to myself, oh, I shouldn't be doing this. There's something really, really wrong here. But I kept going, and part of that reason, and I refer to it in the book as that moment, I did not want to face up to that moment. And when I've interviewed victims of romance fraud, I've heard very similar tales, that they started, after more and more requests for money, they started to think, oh no, there's something wrong here. I know that there's something wrong. But they kept going, and they kept sending money and engaging with these people because there was that chance. Like with gambling, there is that chance that it could all be okay.
Well, this is exactly what the problem has been with the Nigerian scams. You know, I represent the former minister of such and such, and he's got $730 million that he wants to put in your bank account. That one. These things have now been going on since, believe it or not, since post. Literally, letters arriving in the post. The big difference between that and now is the speed of turnaround. You know, you would send a letter, it would take 2 to 3 to 4 weeks to get a reply. So you have plenty of time to work it out. The idea that I've already sunk so much into this that turning back would be unfathomable is the absolute basis of how all of this type of fraud has developed over a period of, well, since the first time I saw it was in the early 1980s. So I think that you're right. It is very much that thing. I'm in so deep that is it that you've reached the point of no return? I don't think it is. Thinking, you know, I've already gone more than halfway, so I might as well just keep going because it's further to go back than to go on. I don't think
exactly.
it is.
And the second that you stop, you then have to deal with the aftermath. You then have to realize that you've given this money to somebody and you've fallen out with people around you, and it's much easier to carry on than it is to stop and deal with everything.
You're talking in the language of addiction, aren't you?
Absolutely.
And so you become addicted to this idea that it is going to work, that either you're going to make that this next turn of the dice is going to bring you wealth, or that next letter is going to bring the money into your bank account. It is very much that form of addiction. Every time you send another piece of money, you feel great for the first 5 minutes, and then you feel really bad for the next 3 months, or however. And should we be looking, do you think, then, at getting people to think about the terminology of addiction when we instead of thinking this is not a romance fraud, it is somebody who is getting you addicted to something? Do you think we could get the message across like that?
Possibly. I mean, I think we're frightened to use the word grooming because obviously it has other connotations, with child abuse, etc. And it's a horrible word, but it is just as applicable here. And I wonder if grooming would be more effective than addiction. But certainly something needs to change in the language that we use, because again, I talk about it in the book. We talk about people falling for fraud, which I find quite disrespectful, because we talk about it into, somebody just walked into it, basically. We don't talk about falling for any other type of crime. So I think language plays a really, really important part in how we talk about fraud from an educational perspective, but also how we talk when we're trying to pull a victim out of it, because nobody wants to be made to feel like they've fallen for something, or that they're a victim of fraud. Nobody wants to be a victim of fraud. But if you talk about grooming and addiction, it can possibly make more sense to people, because they're more emotive words and people take them more seriously.
You're in the very early pages of the book, you talk about the use of the word victim, and whereas an awful lot of the wishy-washy people that I get really cross with are busy trying to say, let's call them victims, let's call them survivors. I agree with you. We should look at it as being a victim, because there is somebody outside that is victimizing them.
Yeah.
And it is, I think that there is a huge mistake in focusing on the victim when we need to get the victims to focus on the fraudsters. So there's a whole industry of people saying, let's look inwards. And I think that's wrong. I think we should be getting people to look outwards, standing in a circle with their backs together, looking out at the world that's trying to attack them. It's not paranoia; they really are out to get you. And I think, that we have got this very wishy-washy. Can I say snowflakey? Of course I can. It's my program. Idea that we must never say to people, there is a fault here, and the world's on your side. Let's have a hug. Kumbaya. Well, no. The fact is, the world is not on their side. A small number of people maybe, but the rest of the world is definitely not on their side. The rest of the world, in very large number, is looking to make each individual a victim. And that is a message that we seem to be afraid to give. And I was very pleased when I read that very clear statement. I like the fact that you don't pull back. There's no bullshit in your book. It's great. You started work on the next book. Talking of books, you've already said it's not going to be in the same style. I frankly think that's inevitable. Great shame, but inevitable, because this book is a hoot from the very first line. And it's a risk awareness that reads like a comic novel, and that's a rare talent. What's the new book about?
So the new book is about the future of fraud. It's a much smaller book. So whereas the Keanu Reeves book is about 65,000, this is only 25,000, and it's part of a larger series of kind of books about the future of different things. So it's not going to be a funny one, but I hope it'll still be as engaging. And it's funny, when you're trying to write about the future of something, which I've found over the last couple of weeks, the problem is it's the future and nobody knows. And as you just said a few minutes ago, you know, you expected something to happen in 10 years and it happened in 2. So I would like to look at, as well as kind of looking at, you know, computer generated images and voice cloning, etc. I would like to look at how the future of fraud is going to be in terms of our human relationships. So as you just said, you know, we are constantly being attempted to being defrauded. You know, it happens all the time. You know, it's insane how many people will get in touch under various guises. And I have found myself increasingly wary. If I get a text about having a doctor's appointment, my first reaction is, what is this? What fraud is this? Then I remember that, oh yes, actually I did make that appointment. And I wonder if in the sort of middle to distant future, our relationships as humans are going to change drastically, because we'll sort of probably end up in this kind of dystopian world of paranoia. And I find it a really interesting concept. So although the book is going to be very different, and I will look in the future to doing a similarly entertaining, amusing book, because that's kind of what I love to do, this is going to be a really interesting one.
I wrote in 1996 a book called How Not to Be a Money Launderer, which was at points 15 years ahead of its time. I wasn't looking into the future. I was just looking at what there was around me and saying, this is what will happen, because there's no reason it won't. But it took, in some cases, anything up to 15 years for that to come into place. And you know, it was a risk management book for financial crime. Before anyone came up with the idea of risk management for financial crime, it included all the things that later became misknown as trade-based money laundering, and the risk-based approach, which the Financial Action Task Force later decided to adopt. It's all in that book in 1996. And I wasn't thinking of the future. I was just thinking, this is where we are. This is how criminals think, and it is going. This is how it will obviously develop. The bigger risk, which has been more difficult to predict, is the response of the authorities to that, because the authorities are, for the most part, incredibly sluggish. They may have a lot of very clever people, but they don't come up with very, very clever stuff. And there are a lot of vested interests which tamp it down, so that you don't get to see the things that you really should get to see, that should be out in the wider public. When you're looking for the future, I don't think you're going to necessarily need to be a futurologist. I think you're going to need to be focused on the present and the technology which is already here, and only small steps making a very big difference. So when you're looking at technology and saying this is going to be a leap forwards, the effect may be a leap forwards, but the technology required to make that leap is actually really small and very incremental. And so I think you won't have a lot of trouble in predicting the future, even though you don't realize that it's the future you're predicting. And I wish you great luck with that book. I think it's I'm looking forward to seeing it. Go on, get on with it. Becky Holmes, author of Keanu Reeves is Not in Love with You. Thank you for joining me on People of Letters.
Thank you.